Let's go ahead and move on to the very latest with regards to Israel, because there is a whole lot that is consequential that is happening there. In particular, the possibility of a ceasefire deal, the imminent possibility of a Rafah invasion, and the imminent possibility of ICC arrest warrants. And these things may seem disconnected, but they actually are all connected. I'll get to that in a moment. But first of all, let's listen to how Secretary of State Tony Blinken is talking about this potential ceasefire deal.
Hamas has before it a proposal that is extraordinarily generous on the part of Israel. And in this moment, the only thing standing between the people of Gaza and a ceasefire is Hamas. They have to decide, and they have to decide quickly.
Oh, an extraordinarily generous offer. Wow. Let's see what's in this extraordinarily generous offer that's been made. Put this up on the screen from the New York Times. So the offer includes a 40-day ceasefire. That's it. 40 days. And the release of potentially thousands of Palestinian prisoners in exchange for the Israeli hostages. Apparently, the big concession is instead of releasing 40 hostages, the Israeli government is prepared to settle for only 33. And, frankly, there's a lot of reports that many of the hostages have been killed. I mean, they've been in an active war zone for 7 months now and subject to the same, siege conditions as everyone else in the Gaza Strip. So you have pretty wide distance between the Hamas position, which is not only we want a permanent ceasefire, not 40 days, a permanent ceasefire, and this is a critical piece too, they want people to be able to return to northern Gaza, to whatever's left of northern Gaza. And that's been something that the Israeli government has been adamantly opposed to. But a very one-sided framing here of, oh, the whole problem is with Hamas. Obviously, these are negotiations. Both sides have to give and take. But to present this as like extraordinarily generous and the best offer and how could they possibly refuse, Saagar, I think is very disingenuous.
Yeah, it's just the key sticking point between them is that Israel says we're going to continue the war no matter what. And the ceasefire is just like a temporary thing on the way. And Hamas, of course, they're trying to use their leverage, which are hostages. And they're like, no, if we're going to give up these hostages, then the war just needs to end, period. I mean, this is a huge problem in Israeli society, too, because this is how they're really, what Israel wants is to have their cake and eat it, too. They want to get they want the hostages out. There were huge it's funny, we cover protests in America. In Tel Aviv, they're lighting shit on fire in the middle of the street yesterday because there's a huge protest continuing around hostages, around the conduct of the war, and Netanyahu. So what they want to do is they want to release all the hostages, which releases the pressure valve in Israeli society, because then there won't be any more pressure on the government to conduct the war differently, but they don't want to commit to ending the war at all. So this is obviously the key sticking point. If I had to guess what Blinken and the Biden administration's theory of the case here is that, and one I don't think is unreasonable, is once guns stop firing for 40 days, it's very difficult to restart the guns. Now, that said, if I had to bet anybody who would do it, I think that the Israelis would.
Yeah.
And that's part of the conundrum that we really face here is that Bibi and his coalition, and really Israeli society, I think we should all be honest, they want to go into Rafah, and they want to destroy it, and they want to level it.
Yeah.
America doesn't want that. Biden, for domestic reasons and for geopolitical reasons, is like, hey, the more violence that we have, the more problems I have here at home and abroad. So we're really stuck because we don't want this to happen, period. This is a delaying action with the hope that we can achieve some permanent ceasefire or whatever in the future. But unfortunately, I don't think it's possible with the current Israelis on the other side of the table.
Well, and with the U.S. unwilling to actually use leverage to enforce any kind of outcome. I mean, just like asking Bibi nicely obviously hasn't worked, and it's not going to work. So you're absolutely right that there's no reason to expect that even if they do secure this 40-day ceasefire deal, Bibi has promised, he repeatedly just promised again, you were sending it to me, that we will go into Rafah. Whether there's a temporary ceasefire or not, we are going in. Another thing that I want to point out, which we talked about at the time, but for some reason the mainstream media I know what reason, but they just chose to ignore the beginning, is that Hamas had offered almost immediately an all-for-all deal, all hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. And the family members of the hostages, they sort of just learned about this, at least some of them, and are realizing like, oh, you, Bibi Netanyahu, all of your talk about your concern for the hostages, this is all bullshit. This has just been an emotional manipulation tactic, because if they were actually your number one priority, they would have been returned already. So there's that. At the same point, they're trying to use, first of all, Rafah has taken on this horrifying symbolic importance, both in terms of, Bibi is making the case that the reason they haven't achieved victory yet is because they haven't gone into Rafah. And you're right, Saagar, that I think the Israeli public overwhelmingly is in favor of continuing the annihilation into Rafah, where you have 1.3 million Palestinians who are sheltering right there along the border with Egypt. This is also being used as negotiating leverage, basically a threat of, we're going to do more horrors and atrocities in Rafah if you don't secure this, limited 40-day ceasefire deal. And we're getting some truly dystopian, horrifying indications of what exactly is planned for Rafah. Let's put this up on the screen. So this is according to Middle East Eye. Israel is planning a ring of checkpoints around Rafah to prevent any men, quote unquote, military age men, from fleeing the Rafah assault. So they say here, the checkpoints are designed to allow some women and children to leave Rafah ahead of an expected Israeli offensive, but unarmed civilian Palestinian men will likely be separated from their families and remain trapped in Rafah during an expected Israeli assault. Previously unreported disclosure of Israel's construction of a ring of checkpoints around Rafah underscores how Israel is pushing ahead with plans to attack that city, where over 1 million displaced Palestinians are sheltering in tents and makeshift camps. So, Saagar, this is directly a war on men. This fits very much with the assumption that we've seen from the Israeli government, official policy, and frankly, media buy-in, that if a man was killed, if even a 16-year-old boy was killed, they must inherently, just because they're a, quote, man of military age, they must be a terrorist. Ergo, they're a legitimate target. That's the way they have been operating. But this is another level of codifying into their approach that if you are a man, any man within what we can colorably describe as military age, then you deserve to be tortured, kidnapped, bombed, and ultimately killed.
Yeah, this is has its roots in kind of counterinsurgency policy, except what they're missing is that they didn't have any effort to separate like non-terrorists from actual terrorists. We usually, this has been done in the past, for example, giving everybody opportunity to flee and then saying anybody who remains in the city will be considered, free. It's basically like a free fire zone.
Yeah, they did that in Gaza City.
Right, exactly. But what they should do, what you really want to do is, if you actually wanted to do this, you separate the male population from the terrorist population. Now, that sounds easy, and it's not easy. It does require a lot of death, but it also requires actually using your military and putting them at risk, which is something that, it's been a while since we've seen the Israelis engage in active combat, like actually on the ground. They're just not willing to do it. They're just basically willing to take as many civilian casualties as possible while keeping their own men safe. Now, in theory, you would be like, well, why wouldn't anybody do that? Well, America didn't do that in the Iraq War and in Afghanistan. You can have plenty of criticisms of our military, but extraordinary measures in many American lives were lost specifically to try and prevent situations like this from happening, which is basically just everybody is declared, free fire zone. There may be very limited instances, but commanders and the overall ethos of the military is that is not the way that you can fight in a country which you're occupying with a huge, millions and millions of people that are there, including millions of men.
Yeah.
In this scenario, they're basically just putting all that aside and engaging in whatever they would want. And I think it's just going to be further evidence, against them in their lack of willingness to fight as a first world military. There is no first world military on earth that would ever fight this way, period. I feel very comfortable saying that.
Many people are pointing out that part of what led the ICJ to conclude that Srebrenica was a genocide was the all-out slaughter of men, 8,000 men who were murdered. They're very similar, they're men, so we're going to kill them and we're just going to assume their military age. There was also a motive of quote-unquote revenge that was offered as justification there, so a lot of historical echoes. But this is deeply chilling, and the reason I say that the media has been complicit in allowing this framework is, both in terms of their just overall coverage, but the way they have assumed from the beginning that, okay, any casualties, any deaths outside of the women and children, we're just going to assume according to the Israeli government, that these are Hamas militants who are legitimate targets by the allowance of the Israeli military to operate in such a way. I mean, this is part of why the IDF murdered their own hostages, both because they were men and because they were in this kill zone where they just assume anyone who's still there must be a Hamas militant. And so this is the part of the way that you've ended up with these overwhelming civilian casualties. So in any case, Rafah is being used both as a political tool for Bibi to hold on to power and say victory awaits if we just go in and destroy Rafah. It's also being used as a bargaining chip in terms of these ceasefire negotiations. I wanted to just put this up on the screen so people know what's going on just in terms of how Hamas is positioning themselves, because it's another thing that is unlikely to be covered by many mainstream outlets. So you had a Hamas official who was saying actually that they would lay down their arms, they would demilitarize if you establish a Palestinian state along the 1967 borders. This isn't the first time they're saying it, but you can think that they're not serious. I think that's entirely legitimate to be like, yeah, but you can't take their word for it. But you do have Benjamin Netanyahu very clearly like, we will never allow a Palestinian state and I am opposed to it with every fiber of my being. And you do have the Hamas people saying, actually, we will lay down our arms and accept a two-state solution, which is contrary to their more genocidal rhetoric from the past. So make of that what you will. Let me put this next piece up on the screen because this is also incredibly important and connects together potential ceasefire, Rafah, and ICC arrest warrants. Apparently, the U.S. and their allies are basically threatening the ICC that if they do issue arrest warrants for the Israelis, then we're gonna blow up the peace deal. There's not going to be any kind of truce. There's not going to be any kind of even temporary ceasefire. So this is what was described as a quiet diplomatic effort. It's really just a threat. It's like basically threatening continued slaughter of Palestinians if they dare actually issue arrest warrants for Netanyahu and others. And Saagar, there's been obvious total hypocrisy with regard to the ICC, and they were issuing arrest warrants for Russia. We were applauding, oh, thank you, you're doing a great job. This is incredibly important. Now when it's our great friends, the Israelis, who have, listen, just by the numbers, the slaughter has been vastly greater from the Israelis vis-a-vis the Palestinians in a much shorter period of time. Now, oh, this is illegitimate, and we have to take actions. And you've got members who are threatening, members of Congress who are threatening to pass legislation to target the ICC in retaliation. You got the Wall Street Journal editorial board threatening some sort of, retaliation against the ICC. So very different response when it comes to Israel.
Yeah, it didn't work out so well, did it? Whenever a year ago it was genocide at Bucha, whenever like 50 people were killed. But now they're like, oh no, we can't be used. It's just so ridiculous. Shows you the U.S. policy, by the way, which I oppose these things in the first place. Let's go and put this up there on the screen. This is my personal favorite pet peeve. The U.S. military pier in Gaza, you guys will remember it was supposed to have been built by now. It was supposed to cost about $150 million. Well, now it's actually scheduled to be built late, and it will cost about $320 million.
Who could have predicted?
$320 million, and pictures are now coming out. I would note, Krystal, that the Port of Baltimore is not yet fully functional, but apparently we have all the money in the world to build a humanitarian aid pier, which is going to put American troops at risk off the coast of Gaza, when the easiest thing that you could do is just be like, hey, Israel, just let some aid in there, by road. That seems like a lot cheaper and a lot easier for us.
Thousands, miles and miles of trucks backed up at these borders. That's right. You don't need a pier. They did actually start construction on the pier, by the way. We did see some images.
It started today. Yeah. Today. Yeah.
We're already basically at the deadline for when they said the thing would be complete. But yeah, the obvious answer is let in the trucks that are lined up at the border. You can use a little bit of U.S. pressure and leverage to make that happen instead of this whole pier debacle, which I think it's worth once again mentioning that Bibi floated, hey, maybe we'll use this pier to help with our ethnic cleansing program and help Palestinians, help them voluntarily migrate out of the territory that we utterly bombed, decimated, destroyed, and left unfit to live in.
Just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Totally ridiculous.
Absolutely. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.